everyone, welcome back. In today's video, I'm going to be explaining exactly what scope is, the types of scope we have available in JavaScript, and how JavaScript identifies the different scopes in our program, right? So JavaScript implements what is known as lexical scoping. Right? It just means that the location where you declare variables or functions in your program determines where those variables or functions are accessible, right? It determines the region where you can access those variables in your program. So because JavaScript is lexically scoped, where you declare your variables or your function declarations defines the area in your program where you can access them from, right? Now, there are two types of scopes in JavaScript. We have the global scope and we have the local scope. And under local scope, we have function scope and block scope. And we're going to go through these different scopes in this program in today's video. Now, this is the JavaScript program we'll be using, right? This is the program we'll be using today to explain scope in JavaScript. So let me explain what is going on here first. Here, this outermost scope in our program, it's not in a function, it's not in anything. The outermost scope in our program is called the global scope, right? And as we can see, it holds two identifiers, the variable A and this function called outer function. So these variables are called global variables because they are defined in the global scope. They're not contained in anything else. They are in the outermost part of this program. They're called global variables, right? Global variables can be accessed from any part of this program. No matter how nested a function is, you can access a global variable from within that function. So we have this variable A and this function here called outer function in the global scope. We can say outer function here is nested in the global scope, right? Now, outer function here is going to create its own scope, which is a local scope. It is local to that function. Remember, we have two types of scope, the global scope and the local scope. Now, what outer function here is going to create its own scope is going to be a local scope. Now, inside outer function, we have a constant called b and a function called inner function. These declarations are enclosed inside outer function, right? Now, they will be associated with outer function scope, right? They will be locally scoped to outer function, which means that they can only be accessed from within outer function. They cannot be accessed from outside this function. These variables will not be accessible from outside outer function, and we're going to see that in a minute. Now, we have the variable b and inner function inside outer function. Now, inner function here is nested inside outer function, and it's also going to create its own scope as well. It's a function, it creates a local scope. Now, inside inner function, we don't have any variable declared in inner function, but we're logging out the result of concatenating the variables A and B, right? So these are the three scopes we have in our program for now. What do you think will happen if we execute this program, right? We're calling inner function here. So let's call outer function. Let me uncomment this. We can see that hello world gets printed out here. So from within this nested function scope, from within inner function scope, we're able to access this variable b that is defined in its parent scope. Inner function's parent is outer function, right? So we're able to access the variable in its parent scope and the variable a, which is in its parent's parent scope, right? A is in the global scope and b is in outer function scope, but we're able to access these two variables from inner function, right? Now, the connection between nested scopes like this is known as the scope chain, right? What's happening here is if a variable is not defined in the current scope, right? For example, we have inner function. The JavaScript engine will try to locate the variable within the next outer enclosing scope, which is outer function here. If it checks outer function and the variable is not there, it continues to move up the scope chain one level at a time. We saw how it was able to access B from outer function. It checked outer function, it didn't see A, it moved to to the global scope, and then it found A there. That was how we're able to log hello world to the console. So it's going to continue to move up the scope chain one level at a time until it finds a matching variable or it reaches the global scope. The global object is the end of the scope chain. Inner function here has access to the variables defined in its outer scope all the way to the global scope, right? The global scope or the global object is the end of the scope chain. So inner function has access to the variables defined in outer function. It has access to, if it was nested, no matter like the depth of the nesting, it will have access to all these outer enclosing scopes all the way to the global object. Now from here we have inner function. Our scope chain right now is inner function, outer function, and the global scope, right? So inner function has access to these two outer scopes, but outer function here has access to the variables in the global scope. Now, so we can conclude that child scopes have access to parent scopes, right? Now, what if we decide to move the variable A from the global scope into outer function scope, right? Into this function scope. If we decide to move the variable A from here, now we can see it's now within the local scope of outer function, right? And of course, hello world still gets printed because inner function has access to its own parent scope. Inner function still has access to it. But if we try to print the value of A to the console from the global scope, we get a reference error saying A is not defined. Why? We're getting a reference error because we're trying to access this variable outside of its scope and it doesn't exist here, right? Now these variables A and B are only accessible within outer functions body, within outer function scope, right? And inner function is contained in outer function. So inner function has access to outer functions, the variables defined in outer function. But these variables are not accessible outside the function scope. Once we leave outer function scope, we don't have access to these variables again. That's why when we log A to the console from the global scope, we get this reference error. So we've seen that child scopes have access to parent scopes, right? If we have a variable defined in inner function, outer function cannot have access to that variable. Outer function doesn't have access to anything going on inside inner function. The same way we can't access the variable B inside inner function from the global scope, right? So the variable B defined in inner function here cannot be accessed from the global, defined in outer function cannot be accessed from the global scope. That is exactly the same way if we define a variable C in inner function, outer function cannot access that variable. So we can say the scope chain moves upward, right? Our scope chain is from inner function to outer function to the global scope. It moves outward or it moves upward. And that's it. It doesn't move inward. No matter how deeply nested the scope chain is, it only moves outward. Now let's see what will happen if we have two variables in different scopes with the same name, right? So if we declare a variable called B inside inner function and set it to ifoma. So here we've defined a variable B inside inner function scope that has the exact same name as the variable in its parent scope. See, it prints hello ifoma. It doesn't print hello world, right? It gets the variable A from the global scope, but the variable B from its own scope. Now this is because it'll first check its current scope for the variable first. It starts with its own scope and then it works its way upward and stop immediately it finds a matching variable name, right? In this case, we declared the variable B inside its own local scope, right? So it's going to use the value that B holds for all operations performed within its own scope. It will never see this B variable declared in its parent scope because it has a variable with the same name in its own local scope, and this concept is called shadowing, right? We can say that the B variable we declared inside inner function shadows the B variable declared in outer function scope. So it's not possible to reference this B variable we have in outer function from inside inner function again, because it's being shadowed by the b variable inside inner function. Inner function now has its own variable with the same name, right? So it's not going to be possible for us, for inner function, to see the b variable defined in outer function again. Okay, remember in the beginning I said we have two types of scopes, right? The global scope and the local scope. Now we're going to see how variables are scoped, or how they behave when they are defined with the different keywords. We have var, let, and const, right? Let's see how they behave when they are defined, when they are declared with these different keywords. So far, the variables we have here, we used let, but let me just explain them again. Now, variables declared with const or let are block scoped, right? They're scoped to their nearest pair of curly braces, and the scope is limited to the enclosing block where they are defined, right? Now, you can't have access to these variables outside the block scope. They're not accessible from outside their block, scope. They're only accessible within their block. So let's take an example. Now I'm going to delete these. Yeah, let's create a block and add a variable to it using the let keyword. And here I'm using curly braces to define one, but if statements, for loops, while loops, they can be used to define blocks of code as well. And they create their own local scopes. So, right. Now, we have this variable A. A is not available in the global scope, right? We created it within a block. It's not available outside this block, right? So if we try to log A to the console from the global scope, right, we get a reference error saying A is not defined, because A is not defined in the global scope. A is only defined, or A is only accessible inside. Let's move the console log statement inside the block, right? So we get 10 because A is only accessible inside this block of scope, inside this block scope. And it's the same thing if we change let to const, right? So we get 10 as well. Let and const are block scoped. They're not variables defined with let and const are not accessible outside their block, right? So let's move this function. If we move this block into a function, let me declare a function. Yeah. And we move the block to the function and move the console log statement outside the block but inside the function. See, we get a reference error saying A is not defined, right? Because A here is scoped to the block. Now, even though this block scope is nested inside the function still doesn't have access to the variables or to anything declared inside this block. This function will not be able to access anything inside this block. And it's also the same thing if we use let. So let and const are block scoped. If you declare variables with either let or const, they're not accessible outside their block, right? But if we change const here to var, see, we get 10 logged to the console, right? Because variables declared with the var keyword are not block scoped. They have function scope, right? This code block does not create a scope. It doesn't create, var doesn't respect the scope created by a block, right? Variables declared with var are function scoped. So this code block does not create a scope for variables defined or declared with the var keyword, but a function body does, right? So var is scoped. This variable here is actually scoped to this our function. If we try to log the value of A to the console, let me just move this outside this function, right? But if we try to log the value of A from the global scope, we're in the global scope now, we get a reference error saying A is not defined, because variables declared with var are function scoped, and variables declared with const and let are block scoped, right? So people, this is all I have for today. Okay, now remember, var variables declared with var are function scoped, right? And variables declared with const and let are block scoped. Now we've seen the basics of scopes, and we've seen the different types of scopes available in JavaScript. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it was helpful, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.